Hi everyone, in today's video I want to share more data about my acne journey and show you how my diet affected my skin over several months in 2024. In my experience, diet has been both the main cause and the solution to my acne. For those of you who are new here, I'm Elissa van Dijk and I started an experiment on myself in March 2024, and it's still ongoing. During this time I mostly isolated myself, tracked my environment and diet in detail, and took daily pictures of myself every morning. What I'm sharing today comes from first-hand experience and over a full year of consistent tracking. Today I'll walk you through the months from May to September 2024, which is when some major dietary shifts began to happen. I had been a heavy bread eater for most of my life, especially in the mornings and evenings, and sometimes even with lunch. I never really questioned it because it was part of my cultural background. So if you're curious to learn more, there's a separate video linked in the top right corner. This video focuses on what came next, a shift away from bread-based meals to a new way of eating. One that clearly had cleared up my face, but also unexpectedly made my body acne worse. I won't be showing every single day, but I've selected meals from each month that represent what I was mostly eating. And I will be sharing my personal observations along the way as well. So let's get started with May 2024. This month was very much a transitional phase for me. I was still following a structured, mostly organic routine. Breakfast at 7 a.m, lunch around noon, and dinner between 4 and 5 p.m. But it's also when I first started cutting back on bread. In the earlier part of May, I was still eating a lot of white and mixed grain bread, usually paired with fresh sheep or goat cheese. But as the days went on, you can see how I started replacing it with things like nut and buckwheat bread. I even added some fruit and began experimenting with fermented foods like natto and fermented vegetables, because I had read online that these are supposed to support gut health and the microbiome. Overall, I was slowly reducing the amount of bread in my meals. It was a gradual, intentional process, more about replacing long-standing habits than cutting things out overnight, which I honestly wasn't able to do anyway, because at the time I still loved that way of eating way too much. Lunches stayed relatively consistent, with organic local potatoes, garlic, chives and onions showing up often, paired with proteins like duck, shrimp or wild-caught mackerel. I kept snacks pretty minimal, usually raw pasteurized sheep milk yogurt, some walnuts or olives. And I drank mostly water and coffee throughout the day, sometimes with frothed sheep or cow's milk. Now, in terms of how my skin responded to these changes, it was a bit of a mixed picture. Toward the end of May, I noticed that my breakouts on my back and chest actually started to increase. At the same time, my face showed some very mild improvement, but nothing dramatic. What was especially interesting is that my acne didn't just clear or worsen uniformly. Instead, it shifted around. One area would get better, and then the other one would flare up. My cheeks mostly stayed clear, my T-zone remained a problem, but the worst flare-ups stayed on my chin. So while there was some movement, it wasn't exactly the progress I was hoping for just yet. By now, my meals were shifting away from bread-heavy routines toward more nutrient-dense combinations. Now I was still eating some rye and buckwheat bread, but much less often, and with more intention behind what I pair them with. On June 5th, I had buckwheat bread with goat cheese and chives, anchovies, potatoes with butter, and a homemade noodle salad made with yogurt and walnut oil. It was a clean, satisfying start that really set the tone for the rest of the month. By June 8th, I went a bit overboard with fermented foods. Natto, kimchi, tempeh, shiitake in vinegar. The idea was gut support, but honestly it became really hard to digest and I struggled to even finish some of it. It was clear that more wasn't always better. On June 11th, I kept that focus but added more variety. Corn and rye bread, goat cheese, natto, roasted peppers, sweet potatoes and camembert. Still clean, still intentional, but maybe a little too heavy on the ferments. Then on June 24th, I tried something new, blood sausage. I combined it with beetroot, sweet potatoes and goat cheese. Now it looked very different from my earlier meals and I was pushing into new territory with organ meats. I had read that they were incredibly nutrient dense, and back then I thought I needed them. By June 27th, the pattern had stabilized. Rye bread with smoked roe, loads of greens, goat cheeses, olives, and lighter fermented touches. Still experimental, still nutrient-focused, but more balanced than the start of the month. Now these combinations gave me more variety, but what really suffered during the month was my digestion. I used the Bristol stool chart to keep track, and on many days I had what they describe as type 6. Fluffy pieces with wedged edges, kind of mushy, almost like diarrhea. Other times it was type 5, soft blobs with clear-cut edges. And honestly, there were days it looked just like cow dung, which is exactly what my partner and I ended up calling it. He was experiencing the same thing, plus occasional dizziness. So it was pretty clear something in our food was the culprit. Something we were eating was irritating our digestive systems. I also felt noticeably more drained throughout the month, like my body wasn't quite catching up with what I was eating. And to this day, I'm not entirely sure what caused it. I suspect the fermented foods and fatty smoked fish played a role, but I'll cover that in a separate video. For now, let's stay focused on the skin changes. Now, when looking at the pictures from June, you can clearly see that my facial acne gradually improved. The flare-ups were still there, mainly around my chin and T-zone. But overall, they were much milder than in the previous months. My cheeks stayed mostly clear, and the redness across my face noticeably went down. Something had definitely shifted, and I was convinced that the dietary changes were playing a big role in that. However, that improvement didn't come without a cost. At the same time, breakouts started showing up in new places, particularly on my upper back, chest and shoulders. Even my arms became affected, which had never been the case before. The texture of my skin in those areas got also bumpier, and inflamed spots became more common. So while my face was calming down, the acne was clearly relocating elsewhere. It was like the inflammation didn't leave, it just moved. And that was frustrating because it made me question whether I was actually improving overall or just shifting symptoms around. Still, it gave me a lot of insight into how my body responds to change, and it was something I would keep an eye on moving forward. The month of July marked another important shift, especially in how my mornings began. I moved away from bread almost entirely and started most days with a bowl of organic plain cheap yogurt from small-scale farmers. I often enhanced it with things like cinnamon, cacao, coconut flakes and local blueberries. That morning ritual felt cleaner somehow, less dense, and it quickly became a staple. The structure of my meals stayed similar. Breakfast around 7 a.m, lunch at 11:30 and dinner between 4 and 5 p.m. But what changed were the ingredients. Most of my lunches and dinners this month revolved around large colorful salads. I paired this with small portions of organic lamb, grass-fed cheeses like camembert and gouda, and root vegetables like early potatoes. There were also plenty of steamed greens like fennel, chicory and lettuce. Often dressed with yogurt-based sauces or apple cider vinegar and avocado oil. Sometimes I added sweet potatoes or even homemade fries, mostly fried in beef fat. I was also drinking even more water throughout the day, filtered tap water only, which might have something to do with the intense summer heat we were having in Vienna at the time. Coffee remained a staple and I kept snacks to a minimum, but still occasionally sipped on a black coffee in the late afternoons and evenings. But the real pattern that started to form and that I didn't catch early enough was my increasing reliance on nuts. Brazil nuts, almonds, hazelnuts, macadamias, walnuts and pistachios. They made their way into nearly every meal. I mixed them into yogurt, added them to salads or snacked on them plain. At the time it felt like a clean whole food source of fat, something health authorities even recommend. But in hindsight it was definitely excessive and it turned out to be a major issue for my acne, which you will see soon in the pictures. That said, most of my lunches and dinners followed a similar structure. Big salads with goat or sheep cheese, organic greens and proteins like lamb schnitzel or steak. I also played with toppings like roasted vegetables, pickles or cold-pressed oils. These were simple but very satisfying meals and checked all the boxes for clean eating. The digestive issues I had struggled with in June, like loose or mushy stools, were nearly completely gone by the middle to the end of July. This was a big win and gave me confidence that I was going on to the right track. My energy levels improved slightly overall, but I still often felt drained after eating, something I didn't solve until recently, which I'll cover more in depth in the next video. For now, I would like to move on to the pictures from July. You can clearly see that the skin on my face had greatly improved. Breakouts were minimal, just occasional pimple, and my complexion was far more even, with reduced redness. Acne around my nose and forehead had mostly cleared, and even my chin, which had always been a major problem area, was looking calmer. I was really happy with that. However, the improvement didn't carry across my entire body. While my back started to show some early signs of clearing, my shoulders and upper arms were a different story. They kept breaking out with new, painful and sometimes very angry-looking spots, much worse than anything I had experienced there before. The contrasts were striking: clear face, but troubled shoulders, and it was so frustrating because I didn't really understand why. Looking back, it's now clear that the excessive nut consumption, especially pistachios, hazelnuts and almonds, was likely to blame. I had been eating slightly more than the recommended amounts daily, but I didn't initially make the connection to my skin issues. That changed after a frightening incident later in the month. My husband's brother went into an anaphylactic shock after eating some of the exact same nuts I had been consuming regularly. That experience jolted me into rethinking everything and led me to a major shift in August when I began dramatically scaling back my nut intake. By August, my meals took another noticeable shift, both in structure and in response to what had become a clear trigger: nuts. At the start of the month, things still looked quite similar to July. I was continuing with breakfast built around sheep yogurt, often plain with nothing added. Sometimes I had tomatoes with sheep mozzarella and avocado, and often large portions of mixed nuts like Brazil nuts and almonds. I was still snacking on them throughout the day, after lunch, after dinner, almost out of habit. Lunches and dinners kept the same structure too: leafy salads with sheep cheese or yogurt-based dressings, lamb or chibabchi cheese, mushrooms, and occasionally a glass of red wine. But while my facial skin remained mostly clear, just the occasional blemish, the acne on my shoulders and upper chest showed no signs of improvement. That contrast became more obvious in the photos. My back was looking better overall, but the shoulders were still breaking out with fresh, irritated spots. And that's when I really began to suspect that nuts might be the underlying issue. I started by cutting out pistachios and almonds and replaced them with hazelnuts, cracked fresh at home. Nothing else really changed. The meals still looked the same: yogurt or eggs for breakfast, followed by lamb, cheese or potatoes, with salad later in the day. But the skin didn't change either. Eventually, I decided to cut out all nuts entirely, and only then did the situation finally start to shift. The inflammation on my shoulders started calming down, and the breakouts slowly became less frequent. You can already see the difference in the images taken around the second half of August, especially compared to the shoulder photos earlier in the month. This marked the point where I knew something had to change more permanently. I had to make some new adjustments and try a different way, because clearly it still wasn't working. So in late August and throughout September, I moved away from nuts completely. At the same time, I brought back a few foods I had cut out before, mainly because I needed something I could snack on. Olives weren't an option. They gave me digestive issues, especially when I ate them daily. I always ended up with stools that looked like cow dung, so I started testing the occasional dessert and a bit of fruit here and there, and a few other things I had been avoiding for a while. I just wanted to see what was possible now that the main trigger for my body acne was out. Pretty soon, it became clear that things still weren't heading in the right direction. Even small changes like a bit of wheat or a few pieces of fruit seemed to bring back some of the breakouts. Overall, my skin looked a lot clearer, especially on my shoulders, chest and back. Those areas had come a long way in just a few weeks. The inflammation had gone down, the texture was much smoother, and for the first time in months, those areas finally looked like they were healing. But at the same time, new spots had already popped up on my face again, mainly around my chin and forehead. They were still very mild at that point, but already showing up in the exact same places I had struggled before. And it didn't even stop there. Over the next weeks, more breakouts started to appear, even in areas that had been calm and mostly clear before. So while it looked like I was making some progress, my skin was clearly telling me that something still wasn't right. The same cycle was starting all over again. So yeah, cutting out one trigger helped, but it wasn't the full answer. There were still a lot of ups and downs after this, and I want to keep this episode from getting too long, so I'll cover it in my next part. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how powerful diet can be when it comes to your acne. You can change your skin through food. It's not always obvious because the real triggers are often hidden. Things like pesticides residues, heavy metals, or natural chemicals in plants that we don't even think about. But once you start paying closer attention and tweaking things step by step, you can actually get to the root of it. If you're willing to make those changes, not just for your skin, but for your health and even for your future kid's health, it's absolutely worth it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video gave you some helpful insight, and I'm already working on the next part, which I will be posting in the coming weeks. See you in the next one.